When it comes to modern trilogies, there's a lot of good ones, but to me, two stand out, and in my eyes, they have more in common than you may think. And for fun, I found myself asking a question. Which of these two is better, the Dark Knight trilogy or the rebooted Planet of the Apes trio? When I examine the films and how they score on a scale of 1 to 10, there is a clear answer. But part of me wasn't satisfied with just this, and I found myself questioning something. Is the whole greater than the sum of its parts? More specifically, I mean, is The Dark Knight, widely acknowledged as the best of the Nolan Batman trilogy, good enough that it lifts the two other films up to the level where I could argue that beyond the math, it is actually the better trilogy? The answer is maybe? I phrase the question this way because, as we'll go into, I find the Apes trilogy more consistent, but a part of me has some doubt. After all, The Dark Knight is arguably one of the most influential and best films of the new millennium. Is that enough to say that it therefore should make up for any faults I had with the other two films, and thus rate it as the superior trilogy? I'm going to dive into this and give my thoughts. But to establish a bit more, I'd like to give my thoughts on the individual films in both trilogies, and then arrive at whether or not one can be fairly crowned above the others, math be damned. Let's start with Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. We won't go super in depth, but here's my general opinions. Batman Begins, I have some problems with. Generally speaking, it's a good story, but poor shot selection and some deja vu moments hurt it. The setup of who Batman is, I feel, is so widely established that I don't think we need half of a 140-minute movie on it. Side story, I remember betting a friend that when Matt Reeves rebooted Batman again with The Batman in 2022, that if they showed a Death of the Wayne sequence, I'd get up and walk out of the theater. I mean, honestly, it's been shown so many times. I feel at this rate, kids fresh out of the womb know what happened to Batman's parents. But since Matt Reeves knows what he's doing, that didn't happen. Now, I guess I can bring that up because Reeves' job on the last two films in the rebooted Apes trilogy is what earned him the Batman to begin with. But back to Batman Begins, I gave it a 7 out of 10. It's got great stuff in it, no doubt, and I think it's a film that has aged well for me, even if the first half is full of some familiar territory. Also, Scarecrow is underutilized, and the action scenes can be too chaotic due to the close-up cinematography. The Dark Knight, though, was a game changer for comic book films. Aside from some of Marvel's projects, it pretty much set the table for comic book films for the next decade. Dark and gritty. On top of all that, it's undoubtedly one of the best comic book films ever made, and many fans claim it to be the best. Almost no complaints from me here. It's a 10 out of 10. The Dark Knight Rises, well, I remember leaving the theater after a midnight screening, back when those were actually a thing, thinking this film was a masterpiece. But in some rewatches, I've found that the plot holes and clunky storytelling drag this film down. That's not to say it's not impressive with its scale, effects, and ambition. I get what Nolan was going for here, and while it's an imperfect ending to the trilogy, an 8 out of 10 is a fair grade. Now for general thoughts on the Apes reboot trilogy. Rise of the Planet of the Apes has its flaws too. I generally feel the back half of the movie works better than the first half. I love the nods to the original 5 films, which I adore, and could do a whole video about some other time. James Franco is a bit of a dull lead character, but I can't help but feel that that may have been intentional. Andy Serkis helped solidify his dominance as the motion capture master with these 3 films, and when he starts taking this film over, you can see why he was cast. And his performances would only get better as the trilogy rolled on. The last act is also really intense and exciting. I give it an 8 out of 10. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes was a big step up for the series, and not only did the effects get better, but the human and ape interactions also got an upgrade. It was really the first movie in the whole series where you looked at both individual ape and human characters as villains, whereas the original films tried to draw a more distinct line film to film. Reeves did a tremendous job, and I definitely see the argument for why some fans consider this not just the best Apes film in the trilogy, but also the best overall. 10 out of 10. War for the Planet of the Apes is not one I've rewatched very much, to be honest, mostly because the tone of the movie is darker, it's slower paced, and it's basically more of a prison movie than a war movie. But that being said, the emotional heft this film lifts is unlike anything we saw in Dawn. The effects are the best yet. The growing dynamics between the ape characters really shines here, and I can't help but feel that when the film ends on the hardest emotional beat of the trilogy, it not only is a meaningful end to Caesar's story, but also a harkening back to the downer endings of the first 3 films. I find this to be the best of the three, but that's my opinion. Another 10 out of 10 for me. So, when we break that down, the Dark Knight trilogy comes out to an 8.3 out of 10 when averaging the scores out, and the Apes trilogy earns a 9.3 out of 10. So, mathematically, it's not all that close. But some will argue, what about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes? Not a fan of that title. And it's a movie that I thought was fine, 8 out of 10. The second and third acts were better than the first. But do we count it? Well, if we do, it drags Apes down to an average score of 9, still ahead of the Dark Knight trilogy, which definitively ended. But then again, I wouldn't consider Kingdom to be part of the same story. Spoilers, but Caesar isn't in it, except being named, and it's set hundreds of years after his death. I consider it a continuation of the franchise, picking up what the other three films established, without being stuck in the moniker of trilogy, or quadrilogy, I guess, at this point. It also clearly sets up potential sequels too, so it could form its own trilogy at the end of the day, depending on whether or not Disney moves forward with more entries. So, now comes the fun part. The question. Are the shortcomings of Batman Begins and the clunkier elements of Dark Knight Rises enough to say that it is definitively the worst of the two trilogies? Well, I'm still stuck on maybe. But at the end of the day, we're talking about two very successful, respected, and celebrated trilogies of the new millennium, and about the only other one I can name that's this perfect or near perfect is Lord of the Rings. But back to these two, is it really that big a deal if one is considered just a bit lower than the other? It's not like I have to declare the Dark Knight trilogy sucks now because it's being compared to something else relatively close in quality. I think of the 6 films, The Dark Knight is the best. It's not just important for its impact on comic book films, but just on its own a phenomenal movie that arguably caused the Academy Awards to begin including more nominees in the Best Picture field. So some fans may argue because of that, it dwarfs the more consistent quality of the Apes trilogy. Now strictly by the numbers, yes, Apes is better to me. It's more consistent, and stands as proof that rebooting old stories doesn't always end in disaster. Furthermore, while I like the Tim Burton Batman films a lot, especially the first one, I have a soft spot in my heart for 4 of the original 5 Apes movies. Battle for the Planet of the Apes, we just don't talk about that one. The Apes trilogy has lots of callbacks, and was respectful of the lore, proving that completely ditching the original films that made this franchise successful in the first place isn't the only way to go. Now, I'm not putting words in my own mouth here. I'm not saying Nolan intentionally said, forget what Burton and Schumacher did, those were terrible. No, I'm just saying both models can work. Nolan had his own vision for Batman, a less visually inspired one that spoke more to themes through a more dialogue-heavy approach. What Reeves and Wyatt did for Planet of the Apes, though, was similar. They forged a new vision for the Apes films, but arguably reversing what Nolan did. The original Apes films were more about themes and allegories, whereas the newer films kept a hint of that in their DNA, but also weren't afraid to have a more grand visual style in their films. So, in a way, both trilogies reflect a new vision and style than the film series they rebooted. The big difference, though, is that outside of a side joke or two, Nolan largely ignored what came before. Wyatt and Reeves, though, did not. And in my book, that's just as meaningful as what Nolan did for The Dark Knight. These callbacks were genuine, nice touches without being total fan service, again showing fans of the original, young and old, that there's still meaning there. Your love for the originals is justified. For the question of, is it fair to judge these two against each other? Yes. Both are trilogies rebooting a long-running franchise, the tones are somewhat similar, both have had their share of fans and success, and I'd argue both are taking a different approach from what came before. Again, Nolan going more thematic, and Wyatt and Reeves going more visual. Where I do think some fans have me is that unlike the Dark Knight trilogy, where the consensus seems to be tied to one film being the centerpiece, and the other two respectively being admired beside it, it's hard to argue that one particular Apes film is miles better than the other two. Some may like War better than the other two, and some may like Dawn more than the first and third films. But I don't really hear anyone say one particular film was amazing and the other two stunk. Not like I sometimes hear, in less harsh terms, the equivalent being said for the Nolan Batman trilogy. In the end, I do think that being consistent quality-wise should be the goal for a filmmaker, but that doesn't mean that if you have a game changer like The Dark Knight spiking in the middle, that we should overlook that. And in your own perspective, if you find that the trilogy that produced the best individual film should be the best, okay, I'm not going to say it's the dumbest argument I've ever heard. For me, I'm more about consistent quality and simplicity. Think of it this way. The Dark Knight trilogy is like having a meal where part of it is going to be somewhat bitter, Like maybe the drink they're serving is mediocre or there's a side dish that's a letdown, but the entree is going to be like the best thing you've ever eaten. The Apes trilogy is more like a solid meal from start to finish, arguably getting better as it goes along. You leave satisfied, but it doesn't reach the heights of the other entree. It's all a matter of preference. For me, I'd rather not have a bitter part of the meal, or if I need to have one, get it out of the way early, as long as the rest holds up. But that doesn't mean I don't envy, in at least a small way, the table next to me enjoying that better entree. Overall, two things can be true at once. Both trilogies rule, and it's okay to let your preference for one that has its peaks and valleys versus one with a more consistent climb stand without being berated. And we as fans have it the best. We get to have both entrees and eat them too.